James Davis thought a simple backyard barbecue with his family would mark the beginning of a peaceful life in Willow Creek, until a woman with a clipboard interrupted dessert. The air smelled like grilled onions and fresh-cut grass. Children's laughter rang across the fenced yards as Melissa chased her 2 kids through the sprinkler, their soaked shirts clinging to sun-warmed skin. On the patio, William sat in his favorite Adirondack chair, slowly turning pages of the Sunday paper, a mason jar of sweet tea balanced on the armrest. James flipped burgers over the grill with a practiced hand, humming along to the old country tune playing softly from the portable radio. This was what he'd moved here for: stillness, routine, something his mind could finally rest in. He barely heard Melissa calling out, "Hey, the buns are ready!" when a sharp voice cut across the lawn. "Excuse me, what exactly is happening here?" James turned, spatula still in hand. A woman in her 50s, with a tightly clipped bob and floral blouse buttoned all the way to her collarbone, stood at the edge of his backyard. Her heels didn't quite sink into the grass, but her scowl carved a trench all its own. In her hand, a clipboard gleamed under the sun like a badge. "Just having a family barbecue," James said slowly. "Can I help you?" "I'm Eleanor Thompson, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association," she said without smiling. Her eyes scanned the yard like a property appraiser. "I noticed multiple unregistered guests and an improperly parked vehicle in the driveway. According to the HOA bylaws, guests must be submitted for approval 72 hours prior to arrival." James blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's in the covenant you signed. Bylaw 3.12, she replied, already scribbling something on her clipboard. James looked over at Melissa, who was now frowning, her hands gently guiding the children back toward the patio. His father slowly folded his paper, watching. "These are my family," James said. "They're visiting for my birthday." "Regardless, the rules are in place to maintain community standards. A warning will be issued today," Eleanor replied, tapping her pen. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but a pressure he couldn't name. He glanced at the neighbors across the street. Curtains shifted. A woman in a sun hat ducked back behind a hedge. Melissa stepped forward. "The kids are just playing in the yard. We didn't know." Eleanor cut her off. "Unregistered visitors constitute a violation. Noise level, occupancy limits, and driveway obstruction are all noted. This is your first formal warning, Mr. Davis. Further infractions result in monetary fines." "I wasn't aware of this rule," James said, heat creeping into his voice. "But now I know. I'll register them Monday." "That's not how it works. They need to leave the premises today and return only after being properly approved," Eleanor said, still writing. William stood, slow but deliberate. "Excuse me, Ms. Thompson, I'm James's father. Are you telling me my grandchildren can't visit their uncle without paperwork?" Her pen paused mid-stroke. "All visitors must follow protocol. Even judges must comply." James watched the subtle shift in her posture as realization clicked. "William Davis," he said, "federal judge, retired." Eastern District she didn't flinch, but her lips twitched ever so slightly. "The rules apply equally to everyone." William gave a small, thoughtful nod. "I'd be curious to see the legal precedent for denying immediate family access to private property." Eleanor hesitated, then tucked the clipboard closer to her chest. "I'll overlook this violation just this once, but please ensure future compliance." As she walked away, James felt the tension lift, but it didn't disappear. He exhaled, trying to shake off the unease. Melissa leaned in. "Does this happen often?" He shook his head. "First time. Probably just a misunderstanding." Back at the grill, the burgers were overcooked, the moment lost. His nephew Jacob tugged on his shirt. "Are we going to get kicked out?" "Of course not, buddy," James said, but his words felt hollow. Later that evening, after the kids had been tucked into sleeping bags and Melissa had gone upstairs, James joined his father on the patio. They sat in silence, sipping cold drinks as twilight spread across the lawn. "She reminds me of a prosecutor I once saw get disbarred for overreach," William said. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe it's just how things work around here." "Maybe," William said, "but people who monitor sprinkler time and driveway widths don't usually stop there." James looked toward the street. The neighborhood felt off. The same quiet that had once felt peaceful now felt too still, too watched. The next morning, as he walked to the curb for the paper, something caught his eye across the street. Mounted to the lamppost, angled directly at his driveway, was a small black security camera, its red light blinking steadily like a heartbeat. James saw the lens move, following his steps. He froze, then slowly stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. James found the pink slip before his morning coffee, and the fine made it taste even more bitter. He stood barefoot in the foyer, envelope in one hand, mug in the other, as the sun pushed through the blinds. The paper was thick, pink, and official-looking, folded with the precision of someone who enjoyed formality. $500. For hosting unregistered guests. He hadn't even made it to the cream and sugar yet. Melissa wandered in from the guest room hallway, rubbing her eyes and muttering something about the kids needing dry towels. When she saw the paper in his hand, her expression tightened. "Seriously?" she asked. "She's still at it?" James handed it to her and walked to the kitchen. "Apparently we broke community harmony by letting my family sleep indoors." She squinted at the wording. Violation of bylaws 3.12 and 3.14. Oh, come on. This sounds like something a middle school principal would write. James sipped his coffee. "Or a prosecutor with no court," William added, stepping out onto the porch, tea in hand, catching the tail end of the conversation. James joined him outside. The summer morning felt too bright for the tension already brewing. Tiny American flags lined the sidewalks in anticipation of the 4th. Someone down the street was already testing firecrackers. But their block had a different kind of energy. Curtains fluttering, glances exchanged, a silence that didn't belong in a holiday week. Across the street, a wooden sign now leaned against a tree. "All visitors must register." The letters were hand-painted, but the intent was clear. Beneath it, a plastic table and 2 folding chairs had been set up near the subdivision's main road. Martin Greenberg, in a golf shirt and sunglasses, lounged with a clipboard in one hand and what looked like an old camcorder in the other. "Is that—" James began. William nodded. "A checkpoint." By noon, more signs had appeared. Neighborhood watch zone, resident ID required, no exceptions. Sam from next door passed by walking his dog, his eyes flicking toward James. "They did this to the Ramirez family last December," Sam said quietly, not stopping. "Grandparents came for Christmas. HOA fined them, then trash pickup, accidentally, skipped them for 3 weeks. James frowned. "Why didn't anyone speak up?" Sam shrugged. "They moved out. House sold under market." Later that afternoon, James returned from picking up groceries. As he turned onto his street, he saw Eleanor and Martin setting up a small folding barrier across the entrance. Eleanor carried a megaphone. Martin held a traffic vest like he'd just declared himself sheriff. James pulled over, rolled down his window, and stared. "Community security enhancement," Martin said brightly. "You'll need to sign in before proceeding." James laughed once, dry and humorless. "You're blocking public access." "This is a private road under HOA jurisdiction," Eleanor replied, appearing at his window. "Please cooperate." He drove around them without another word. That night, as dusk settled over the rooftops, Kate cried out from the living room. Tom rushed to her side, panic in his voice. "James, her water broke." James leapt up, grabbed keys, and helped Kate down the steps. Tom held her bag tight against his chest, breathing fast. As they pulled out of the driveway, headlights blinded them. The familiar black SUV was parked sideways across the main road, right behind the makeshift checkpoint. Eleanor stepped out slowly, followed by Martin and two others James didn't recognize. "Going somewhere with unregistered guests?" Eleanor asked, pointing at Kate, who was now clutching her belly and breathing hard. "She's in labor," James shouted. "Get out of the way." Eleanor stood firm. "You should have registered them in advance. Emergency situations don't excuse repeated violations." Tom leaned forward. "Please, the baby's early. We need the hospital." Martin pulled out his phone, started recording. "Documenting the incident for board review." Kate let out a scream, folding forward. "Call an ambulance," James barked. Tom was already dialing, voice shaking. The men with Martin didn't move. They just watched. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. Then another. Doors opened. Neighbors began to emerge in robes and slippers, drawn by the shouting. Mrs. Wilson, who lived across the street and always brought lemon bars to community potlucks, stepped forward. "Eleanor, what are you doing? That woman needs help." "This is HOA business," Eleanor snapped. "Return to your property." 10 minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. The ambulance had to park at the corner and wheel the gurney around the blockade. The medics worked quickly, lifting Kate with practiced ease. One of them shot James a look that said, "This isn't the first time we've dealt with power-tripping neighbors." Tom climbed into the back of the ambulance. James turned to Eleanor, fists clenched but controlled. William had walked out and now stood beside him, arms crossed. He looked at Martin, then back at Eleanor. "That's obstruction of medical transport. Let's see how you explain that." Eleanor said nothing. She adjusted her collar, turned, and walked back to her SUV. That night, after James returned home from the hospital parking lot, too wired to sleep, he opened his inbox and stared. A single email had arrived from an anonymous address. No subject line, no signature, just 6 words. "Don't fight them. They always win." The hospital smelled of disinfectant and tension, but James could only think about what Eleanor might do next. The delivery had gone smoother than expected, given the chaos just hours before. Kate was resting now, pale but smiling, and the baby, a tiny girl with a surprisingly strong grip, was nestled against her chest under a warm blanket. Tom had barely left her side. Nurses moved in and out with quiet efficiency, but James lingered near the window, arms crossed, eyes on the hallway. He couldn't shake the unease. Not about Kate, she was in good hands, but about what was waiting for them back home. He replayed the blockade in his head, the look on Eleanor's face when William had confronted her, and the way Martin filmed it all without flinching. William entered the room quietly, carrying a styrofoam cup of coffee. He nodded to Tom, then placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder as they stepped out into the hallway. "She's not just petty," William said calmly. "She's practiced." They didn't say much on the drive back, just exchanged glances when they passed the HOA checkpoint, which had now expanded to include orange cones, a laminated signboard, and 2 additional folding chairs. No one sat there tonight, but the message remained. Back in James's kitchen, the mood was heavy. The overhead light buzzed faintly as William unfolded a thick folder from his briefcase and spread out the HOA documents James had signed during escrow. "These covenants," he said, tapping the second page, "look legitimate on the surface, but a few things are off." James leaned over. "Like what?" "Look here, Amendment 2019C. That's the one they reference when citing guest registration and fines." "Okay." "There's no signature," William said, "and no county file stamp. It's formatted like a legal document, but lacks proper submission." James blinked. "You mean it's fake?" William didn't answer immediately. He opened his phone and dialed a number from memory. "Debbie, "It's William Davis. Do you still run the county recorder's office?" He walked out onto the back porch as he talked. The night air was thick with the scent of cut grass and something faintly chemical, like new paint or plastic tarps. When he returned, he was holding a notepad. "She's going to check the records first thing in the morning," he said, sitting down. "In the meantime, let's take a closer look at those vendors they list in the HOA budget." They dug through the annual reports and payment logs. James had kept every HOA notice since moving in. One name showed up again and again: Greenberg Landscaping and Site Management. "That's Martin's company," James said. "He's on the board." William raised an eyebrow. Conflict of interest, especially if there was no competitive bidding. The next day, James met a young woman in a gray blazer on his front porch. She introduced herself as Taylor from the County Chronicle. "I heard what happened with your sister," she said. "We've received several tips about the HOA in this neighborhood. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" James hesitated. "You can ask," he said, "but I'm not the one you should talk to." William appeared behind him in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Taylor looked up. "Judge Davis?" "I'm retired," he said, "but I do enjoy reading about community affairs." She smiled politely, pulling out her notepad. "Would either of you like to go on record?" William shook his head. "Not today, but keep your eyes on the HOA mailbox. You might find something worth printing there." Later that evening, Debbie called back. "Judge Davis, I triple-checked. That amendment from 2019 was never filed with our office. Legally, they're still operating on bylaws from 2006. Anything newer isn't recognized under county records." William said nothing for a long moment. Then he pulled a pen from his shirt pocket and began to underline passages in the printed covenants. "They've been enforcing rules that don't exist," James said slowly. "More than that," William replied. "They've been doing it in writing, on paper. That's going to matter." As the porch light clicked on above them and crickets began to sing, James turned to his father, eyes heavy but sharpened by purpose. William hung up and told James, "We don't need to fight them. We just need to unmask them." James opened his blinds to find a woman in a gray suit holding a clipboard. Only this time, she wasn't from the HOA. The early light spread evenly across Willow Creek, casting long shadows over the trimmed lawns and flag-lined sidewalks. The woman stood still outside the HOA office across the street, surrounded by a small group of county staff, all in plain business attire. A sealed envelope was taped to the glass door beside her. Within minutes, more cars arrived, one unmarked sedan, 2 county trucks, and a van marked with the county seal. Residents began to trickle out in their robes, coffee mugs in hand, whispering as they pointed from their driveways. James stepped onto his porch as William emerged behind him, already dressed in slacks and a light blue shirt, holding a folded sheet of paper. "Paper trails are like tripwires," William murmured. "One step wrong, and they explode." By mid-morning, the vans had been unloaded. Boxes labeled Finance 2021 and Correspondence Internal were stacked on plastic tables in front of the office. Linda Reyes, the county auditor, moved with calm precision, speaking only when necessary and never raising her voice. Her clipboard stayed tucked under one arm like a badge of authority, far heavier than anything the HOA had ever wielded. Across the street, Martin stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, his mouth drawn into a rigid line. Eleanor was nowhere in sight. James's phone buzzed in his hand. The email was short, unsigned, and sent from an address that had no name attached. Check drawer 2B, finance logs. HOA never filed 3 years straight. No punctuation, no hello, just information. And it matched what William had suspected all along. Later that afternoon, the community center buzzed like a summer carnival, except no one was smiling. People arrived in waves, some still in yardwork clothes, others dressed as if they'd been waiting for this moment. A table near the door overflowed with store-bought pie slices, lemonade in plastic pitchers, and styrofoam cups. Fold-out chairs scraped across the tile floor as neighbors took their seats, more curious than combative, at least for now. William stood at the front, not at a podium, but beside a rolling whiteboard he'd wheeled in himself. Taylor leaned against the side wall, notebook in hand, phone raised occasionally to snap a photo. James sat near the back, letting his father take the lead. "Ladies and gentlemen," William began, his tone steady, "I want to share what we've found, not based on rumors or emotion, but on records, filings, and financial statements you've all contributed to, knowingly or not." He clicked a small remote. The projector on the wall flickered to life, showing a spreadsheet with vendor payments year by year. "Over $43,000 paid to Coastal Dynamics, LLC, William said. "This company was registered last year under the name of Eleanor Thompson's husband." The room hushed. Someone near the front gasped. Others leaned forward in their seats. A voice from the right, sharp, defiant, cut in. "This is slander," Eleanor snapped, striding into the room. Her posture was tight, her eyes burning. "These attacks are coming from people who don't understand what it takes to maintain order. There are forces outside this neighborhood who would love nothing more than to see us fall apart." William didn't flinch. "These aren't attacks, they're public records." Eleanor shook her head. "I've served this community for 20 years. "And in that time," Linda Reyes interjected, stepping forward, "there have been multiple payments lacking invoices, vendor contracts awarded without competitive bidding, and amendments to the bylaws not filed with the county as required by law." Eleanor's jaw moved, but no sound came out. Taylor scribbled something quickly. A man 2 rows behind James whispered to his wife, and she shook her head slowly, as if everything was starting to fall into place. William tapped the final page pinned to the whiteboard. "Here's a copy of the 2019 amendment Eleanor and her board have cited repeatedly. It lacks a stamp, signature, or formal record with the county. That means the rules you've been fined under are invalid." Linda glanced at the room, then stepped forward with authority. "The board's authority is now suspended until further notice. We'll be taking over from here." James found the letter on his porch, typed on old stationery, unsigned, and smelling faintly of cologne. It was early, the sun still low and gentle through the pines, and the dew hadn't yet burned off the lawn. James had gone out for the paper, barefoot, half awake. The letter had been slipped under the mat, its edges yellowed, the typeface uneven, like it came from an old ribbon-fed typewriter. "You've stirred up more than you understand. Some homes don't come with second chances. No name, no return address, no smudge of a fingerprint. Only that smell, faint but distinct, like someone trying too hard to pretend they weren't afraid." He brought it inside without saying a word. By the time William came down for coffee, James had already locked the front door and checked the windows twice. "It was deliberate," James said, handing it over. "And personal." William read it slowly, then folded it and slipped it inside a folder already thick with documents. "This will be useful," he said calmly. "It says more than they think." Later that afternoon, James sat under the shade of Mrs. Rose's magnolia tree, a paper plate balanced on his knee with a warm slice of peach cobbler. Rose sat beside him in her wicker rocker, gently fanning herself, her gray curls tucked under a wide-brimmed sun hat. "You know, I remember when this neighborhood was run by bake sales and garden parties," she said. "Not barricades and background checks?" James nodded. "It's not just us anymore. Taylor says they're investigating 3 other neighborhoods Eleanor's been involved with." Rose narrowed her eyes. "You ever heard of someone named Mrs. Schmidt? Used to be HOA secretary?" "She was before my time," James replied. Why? Because she's looking for you. An hour later, Mrs. Schmidt arrived at his door with a small bag clutched in both hands. Her steps were nervous but steady. She looked around before she spoke, as if the bushes had ears. "I shouldn't be here," she said, then handed over a flash drive. "But you need to see this." On the drive were scanned documents, notes in Eleanor's handwriting, lists of residents with red circles around certain names, timestamps from the security cameras positioned at entrance points, and even drafts of emails that never should have been saved. One folder was labeled simply, "Leverage." "She kept records on everyone," Mrs. Schmidt whispered, "who defaulted on dues, who had an affair, whose kids dropped out. She called it community management. I call it blackmail." Before James could ask more, a car door slammed. Martin Greenberg was walking straight up the drive. "Thought your kind was good at hiding behind fences and paperwork," he growled. "You're violating a restraining order," William called from the porch, stepping into view. "You're 15 feet too close." Martin didn't slow. Officer Jenkins pulled up before he got to the first step. "Mr. Greenberg," Jenkins said calmly, exiting his cruiser, "you'll need to come with me." Martin scoffed, but the handcuffs clicked anyway. By the next morning, William had finished the emergency filing. He placed the folder on the dining room table with deliberate care. The header read, "Petition for Emergency Charter Revocation, Willow Creek Estates, HOA." "It's time," he said simply. That evening, the community center filled to bursting. Folding chairs scraped, pies lined the back table again, and the room swelled with the heat of too many bodies in one place. James stood near the wall, listening. One by one, neighbors began to speak, not with rage, but with weary frustration. "They fined me for leaving a garden hose uncoiled," someone said. "They cited me for seasonal decor in October," another added. Mrs. Wilson spoke softly. "They measured my birdbath for height violations. It's concrete." Taylor stood in the back, phone raised. Across the room, a man James didn't recognize leaned toward him. "Eleanor's lawyer just requested a closed-door hearing," he said under his breath. "That's never a good sign." Eleanor entered the courtroom with her head held high, but her hands trembled when she saw the judge. The room was stark and quiet, the kind of silence that made paper shuffling sound like thunder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as neighbors filled the gallery rows in quiet anticipation. Reporters stood against the walls, notepads and recorders ready. Taylor from the County Chronicle sat near the front, eyes focused. Judge Anita Martinez presided in a simple black robe, her expression unreadable. When she looked up from the case file, her gaze landed on Eleanor like a gavel. James sat beside William near the front, calm but alert. They had dressed simply. Nothing performative, just clean suits and steady eyes. Behind them, the people of Willow Creek watched in silence. Eleanor's attorney rose. "Your Honor, my client was merely upholding the standards set by previous administrations. She acted in continuity, not with criminal intent." Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. "And the offshore accounts? The surveillance logs? The signed letters denying emergency access during medical transport?" Eleanor shifted in her seat. For the first time, her chin wavered. Her hand, still clenched in her lap, trembled as the judge turned a page. William stood next. He approached the bench with the same slow certainty he had always reserved for closing arguments. "These are copies," he said, lifting a folder, "of the HOA's financial statements from the past 3 fiscal years. Transferred funds to Coastal Dynamics LLC, later traced to a Bermuda-based holding account. No board vote, no resident consent." He handed the documents to the bailiff, who delivered them to the bench. Judge Martinez read a few lines, her mouth tightening. "And these emails," William continued, "detail Eleanor Thompson's approval of fines based on non-existent bylaws, and her direct correspondence with vendors tied to personal gain." Eleanor's lawyer tried to interject, but the judge raised her hand. "I've seen enough." The gavel struck once. This court finds sufficient evidence of fraud, abuse of authority, and violations of state charter law. The HOA charter of Willow Creek Estates is hereby revoked, effective immediately. The air in the courtroom shifted. An invisible weight lifted from the room. Furthermore, the judge added, this court is ordering an investigative audit into all 17 communities formerly associated with the same administrative personnel. Criminal proceedings will follow separately. 2 deputies approached Eleanor. She didn't resist as they led her out. Martin, seated near the back, tried to slip out quietly, but a plainclothes officer intercepted him. William returned to his seat without expression. James let out a slow breath. Later that week, under a soft peach-colored sky, neighbors gathered once more, this time in James's backyard. The sprinklers were off, the lawn freshly cut. Folding chairs circled under the string lights. A pitcher of iced tea sat sweating on the table. Somewhere in the corner, Frank Sinatra hummed from an old radio, his voice smooth over the hush of evening. William sat near the back with baby Ellie on his knee, gently rocking her as Kate laughed beside him. Tom handed out paper plates with slices of lemon pound cake. James stood beside the grill, not cooking this time, just watching. People came to thank him, not loudly, not ceremonially, just a quiet nod, a handshake, a shared moment. Then someone said it aloud. "You should lead the new board, James, at least until we get our feet back under us." There were murmurs of agreement. Someone handed him a clipboard, already half full with signatures. James signed the first act of his temporary role that same night. It was one sentence. "All families welcome anytime." He taped it to the community bulletin board himself. As the stars emerged above the trees, James returned inside and checked his email one last time. At the top of his inbox, a message waited. Subject: Help us from Hillside Acres. HOA. We heard what you did. Our HOA's worse. Can you help us? On that warm August evening, as neighbors gathered under the porch lights with lemonade in hand and children's laughter returned to Willow Creek, the weight of fear had finally lifted. What began with a clipboard and a warning turned into a quiet revolution, one built not on anger, but on truth, persistence, and unity. In standing up to abuse cloaked in policy, the community learned that power isn't in titles or bylaws, but in people who refuse to be silenced. Justice doesn't always knock loudly. It sometimes arrives in a manila folder and a neighbor's quiet courage. And in towns like Willow Creek, where fences once divided, now porches connect, and the roots of community grow deeper than any HOA rule could ever reach.